let's actually start with the checklist for this week. So you'll see that we have read and take notes on the Outline of American Literature, Chapter 1. Has anyone looked at that yet? This is like the introductory material for the time periods. You're going to have these most weeks. We didn't have them before, but this is Chapter 1. You can click the link to open it. The link should work. If you open it in a new tab, that's usually the best way to do it. So it will take you to this website. And this is what I told you was like the online textbook for the class. You don't have to pay. There are no access codes or anything like that. But notice what it says for the chapter heading for Chapter 1. It says Early American and Colonial Period. Right? Early American is the same thing as pre-colonial, right? Pre-colonial is everything that came before the colonization of America. So this particular chapter is actually 2 periods in one chapter. Does that make sense? For the most part, though, if you look at the chapter headings on the left-hand side here, Revolutionary Period is here, Romantic Period is Chapter 3. Actually, Romantic Period is Chapter 3 and 4. They break it up into 2 separate chapters. Then you have Realism as a chapter, Modernism, and finally Contemporary. This one here where it says 1945 to 1990, that would be considered postmodernism. So these pretty much correlate with the time periods that we're going to be studying, the chapters there. Okay, they're not extremely long. I print them all out, and I keep them in a notebook like this. You can print 2 pages per sheet of paper if you want to, but it's incredibly small. So if you have bad eyes, you might want to print it 1 page per sheet. But I keep it all here. I take notes. If I were taking quizzes in this class, I would definitely have it printed out and available so I didn't have to switch back and look for things. All right, so I would definitely recommend printing out these chapters if you can. I don't print from this web version here. I print from the PDF version, which is found in Lessons, Reading, Writing, and Research Resources. No, I'm sorry, next one. Supplemental Resources. Outline of American Literature, this should be the PDF. And this will allow you to print the 2 pages per sheet of paper. It's a pretty big file, so it takes a while to upload, but it is there. And you'll notice that the chapter headings are the same exact thing. It's just a different format for you. So we'll come back to that in a second. So that was your first reading assignment there, is to read and take notes on that Chapter 1. Next, your selected readings for this week include Roger Williams, Anne Bradstreet, Mary Rowlandson, Cotton Mather, and Jonathan Edwards. Is anybody familiar with any of those writers from past educational experiences or pleasure reading? Which one? Bradstreet. She's pretty famous. She's one of the first published American women that there is. American Lit. Yeah, that's a popular selection for American literature. That's one of my favorite selections in this book because there's so much to it. Hopefully we'll get some time to talk about that one on Thursday. Cotton Mather, he was involved in the Salem witch trials, or maybe just before the Salem witch trials, if anybody read or learned about those. Mary Rowlandson, she wrote the captivity narrative about being captured by Indians. Anne Bradstreet, she was a Puritan and, like I said, one of the first women to be published in America. And Roger Williams is one of my favorite authors, not just from this time period, but for the entire start to finish selection of American literature authors. More for his thoughts than his writing style. We would not have freedom of conscience or freedom of religion or freedom of speech if it weren't for Roger Williams. Well, I take that back. We might have it, but it was his ideas that really got things moving in that direction. If it weren't for him, it wouldn't have come until much later. So that's why I think he's very interesting. All right, so we have some good people to read for this particular period. Remember, this is the colonial period, so this is before the Revolutionary War, but it's after the explorers, right? All right, you have a discussion for this week. Discussion forum 2, complete your original response by midnight on Thursday. Complete at least 2 responses to other students by noon on Monday. Did anyone have any issues with the first discussion forum? Technical issues? No, you were okay getting that done? I'll try to have those graded for you before Thursday. That way you have feedback and know how you could maybe adjust your responses if you need to. And down here it says complete week 2 quiz. That should actually say week 3 quiz. I'll fix that. So complete your week 3 quiz, and it's due by February 3rd, which is Monday at noon.
I have a question.
Yes.
About the presentation.
Yes. Question about the presentation. What about it? Did I go over the presentation on Thursday? I don't believe so. I did talk about the different topics for class. So the class topics are found in lessons down here at the bottom. And this will actually be helpful to have open because I'm going to come back to it. So there are all these different questions that you should be considering as you do your readings. All right, one of the tips that I gave students on Thursday was to print this sheet out for every week. Every week, print this sheet out, and if you can answer any of these questions based on the readings that you did, like let's say you read Anne Bradstreet's poem, and it says, you know, how have the literature and authors from this course challenged or reinforced your prior beliefs? You might say, well, I previously believed that, you know, there were no female authors published in America until the women's rights movement of the 1960s. However, I now have discovered that Anne Bradstreet was published in the 1600s. So that has challenged one of my beliefs. That would be one of your answers to these questions here. Some of them you might not come up with answers for. Some of them you might say, like for are conflicts between cultures in America unavoidable? You might say, well, upon looking at Anne Bradstreet's work, there's really no indication of conflicts between cultures. She was mostly writing personal poems and letters that didn't really appear to involve much conflict between culture. Fine, that's wonderful. All right, but you can make notes on here because these topics are for your presentation and your essays. Presentation and essays. All right, so I'm actually going to go over the instructions for your essay number 1 today. It's not due for a couple weeks because it's based on the first 3 time periods we've studied, and we're only starting the 2nd time period right now. So it won't be due until after the Revolutionary time period. All right, so we still have to get through this one, then the Revolutionary period, then your essay will be due. But I'm going to go over the instructions for it today so you know what to be looking for. But the essay is going to be based on one of these questions, and it's up to you which one you choose. I'm not going to pick the question for you. So if you're going through, every time you do a reading, like you read a poem or a letter or a selection, and you go through and you look and you say, how could this apply? Maybe just make a note, like if it was conflicts between cultures and you're thinking, the Native American creation stories. Actually, you only had one. Just put a note there, you know, write it down, and then you might have some notes in your textbook if you're being a good student and taking notes in your book, which you're allowed to do. You can even write in pencil in these books, and they'll still buy them back if that's your concern. Now you know, okay, if this is going to be my essay topic, I can go to the Native American creation story because I made some notes there regarding that question. And that's the question I want to go with. And then when you get toward the end of the semester, you flip through all these sheets. If you have one for every time period that we've studied, you can look and say, wow, I have so much information for this particular question from almost every time period. That would be a perfect one to do my presentation on. Then you go back and you look at your notes, and you compile all that information and present it in a logical way to me. Does that make sense? So does that answer your question about presentations? That's pretty much all we talked about on Thursday, is how those questions could apply to the different readings. So in class, what you can do is ask me questions, right? You can say, I'm pretty interested in the science and technology, but I wasn't really sure if selection X applies to that topic. And I could say, well, let's look at selection X. What do other people think? Do you see any evidence of science and technology? Do you see any evidence of clash between cultures? Do you see any evidence of the ideal American philosophy on immigration? Or do you see a conflict? Or do you see a reality that conflicts with that ideal? Right? We can talk about that in class. I can help you find the answers to those questions in class. It makes your essay writing easier. It makes your final presentation easier, right? That's what class is for, to build these products that you're going to give me that show me that you've learned things. So in the week 3 folder, I did post the essay 1 instructions. Instructions based on one of the topics. We just looked at the topics. Write a 550 to 850 word essay. That is approximately 2 to 2.5 pages. If it's 2 full pages, you're in good shape. If it's 1 page just spilling a little onto the second page, that's not 2 pages. That's 1.25 page, right? So 2 full pages, 2.5 pages is pretty sufficient for this assignment, okay? Be sure to use appropriate MLA in-text citations and works cited page. If you're not familiar with MLA in-text citations or works cited pages in MLA format, you should not be in the class. All right, that was a prerequisite for English 1101. Right, that is what you learn in English 1101. So you either shouldn't be in the class or you have some work to do on your own to figure out what that is. I can point you towards some resources if you need me to, but that is a prerequisite that you understand how to do in-text citations and works cited. All right, if you just Google MLA in-text citations, you'll come up with some YouTube videos and tutorials that will help you. All right, there are thousands of them out there. If you need to refresh on that information, if it's been a while since you did that kind of stuff, just Google it. Okay, you can find helpful YouTube videos. Purdue Online Writing Lab has a bunch of information regarding MLA style and MLA documentation that can help you. I don't know if they have videos, but they have handouts and worksheets that can help you out. All right, be sure your thesis is clear and supported throughout your paper. This is what's called expository writing. Expository writing. It's writing that's based on a thesis statement. Okay? If I go to expository essays, I just Googled expository writing. Purdue Online Writing Lab is one of my go-to sources. If you look at this, it says expository writing is the kind of writing that is based on a clear, concise, and defined thesis statement. Does anybody know what a thesis statement is? You should. What is it, Cody? What's a thesis statement? It can be an answer to a question. There are 2 parts to a thesis. Who remembers? Subject plus opinion. Okay, subject plus opinion. And for your particular thesis statement, it will absolutely be an answer to a question because I showed you what the topics were. The topics are not the thesis. The topics are general topics. But your thesis statement, Cody, you're exactly right, will be an answer to one of those questions because all your topics are given to you as questions. They have to be. They're pretty much, all the topics I give you are based on your opinion. They're all questions that are, they're not factual, right? The topic isn't, you know, who was the first woman published in American literature, right? That wouldn't be an essay. That would be a sentence. You know, that would not work for an essay. And that's why I'm showing you this link for expository writing, because it says that expository writing is based on a thesis statement, and it presents some kind of, here it is, it sets forth some kind of argument, right? It persuades the reader. If you have a thesis that's a subject and an opinion, well, guess what? If you have an opinion, everybody has a right to an opinion, right? But you have to back it up if you want somebody to agree with your opinion. You have to make the argument. You have to give the evidence. Does that make sense? That's what you're doing when you write one of these essays. I think you only have to write 2 this semester. Okay, so it says, be sure your thesis is clear and supported throughout your paper. If your thesis statement is an answer to one of those topic questions, you're in great shape. Now, it says clear. That doesn't mean simple. Some of these questions don't have simple answers, right? If I say, let's see, what were the topics? Are conflicts between cultures in America unavoidable? A simple yes or a simple no might not be, it might not do the question justice, right? You might say, in some instances, yes, the conflicts were avoidable. However, in others, they were not. right? So it can be a more developed answer than a simple yes or no.
How do you make that persuasive if you say it could be one way or the other? I mean,
Okay, I see what you're saying. So if you feel like you're kind of sitting on the fence, yeah, in 1101, I usually teach students, like, take a firm stance one way or the other, and that's just to get your critical thinking going. But in this case, if you feel like your answer is a little bit more nuanced and more complicated, that's okay. You can still defend your position and say, yes, in these instances it was because, and then you prove your point. However, in these instances, the conflicts were completely unavoidable because, so as long as you're answering that question because, you're in good shape. You can I wouldn't call it waffling. It's just saying it's a complicated answer. You know, it looks like a simple question, yet the answer is complicated. Sometimes you might have a very strong feeling as to the answer. Like last year, one of the topic questions that I removed was, is America a Christian nation? So usually people had very strong feelings one way or the other. They didn't typically waffle, right? They usually said, yes, it is, or no, it's not. The only reason I removed that from the list is because so many people chose it, which was good. I'm glad. It was a good question. But I get tired of reading the same thing over and over. You know, it ends up becoming the same argument. You know, at some point, I'm not getting new information. And that kind of affects the way that I view your paper. And I don't want to set you up for failure or set you up to bore me. That's not fair to you. So that's why I removed it. But we can talk about that throughout the semester if you want to. The idea of religion and the founding of America, because it's very important. You know, is America a Christian nation? It's a question that people debate all the time. So that's something to consider too, but that is kind of off the table for your essays and presentations. All right, it gives you a hint. It says, well, it's not necessary. Consider using the same topic you intend to use for your final project. You don't have to, but if you have a topic that you're really attached to from the start, maybe that's the one you want to stick with for Essay 1, Essay 2, and your final presentation. Sometimes that helps people out, gives them some focus in the class. You know exactly what you're looking for every time you read one of the selections. You say, okay, I like science and technology. Let's see if I can find any science and technology this week in any of these selections. All right, if you want to. You don't have to. It can be. It can be easier to focus on one thing for each essay and the final presentation. But then again, if you run into like these first 3 time periods, if you don't feel like you're finding any information about education, and like you were thinking that would be a good topic at the beginning of the course, but the first 3 time periods you don't see a lot on education, it might not make a very good essay if you don't feel like you found enough information, right? So, but then maybe the next 3 time periods you find a whole bunch of stuff, so that's good for essay 2, and then maybe you can put it all together for your presentation, but it might not work for one of the essays or the other. Does that make sense? So it can give you the focus. It just depends what you find and how you interpret things. All right, specific instructions using cited evidence, cited from the assigned readings. Assigned readings from the textbook and the outline of American literature. Those are the assigned readings. All right, for the essay, you don't have to go outside of the assigned readings. All right, you need to start with the assigned readings. If you do end up going outside of the assigned readings, you better have started with evidence from the assigned readings. Right? If you just give me information from all these other sources and didn't use your assigned readings, that's not helpful. Okay, that's not what I'm asking you to do.
Are you going to want more than one source?
Absolutely. And I'll get into detail about that as we go. If you had to take a guess, how many sources do you think you'll need for this paper? It's a decent guess. How many time periods are we studying? How many time periods are involved with this essay? 3. How many sources do you think you're going to need?
What are the exact dates of the different times?
Dates for the time periods? So far, all we have is question mark to 1620 for pre-colonial. That's all you have so far. That's all you have so far. However, you can probably take a guess as to what the starting point of the next one is. If the last one ended at 1620, this one has to start at 1620. Okay? We'll get there. We'll get there. You're jumping ahead of me. That's all right. Anybody want to take a guess? Well, we're on it. When do you think this time period might end? 1800? It's a pretty good guess. Why 1776? What's the next time period called? Who was paying attention? We moved from colonial to That's a good guess, but no. I guess it is technically post-colonial, but that's not what we call it. I showed it to you in the outline of American literature. Revolutionary. So if it's revolutionary period, your guess of 1776 is close. That was when the actual revolution happened, but that's not when the thinking and the ideology behind the revolution started. Okay, so we'll get there. We'll get to it. Back to the essay, though. All right, using cited evidence from your assigned readings, describe the role of your selected topic in literature throughout the pre-colonial, Puritan/colonial. So this particular time period is called the Puritan/colonial. All right, some people call it the Puritan period, some call it the colonial period. I'll use those terms interchangeably, okay? It's the same period, though. And the Revolutionary period. So 3 literary time periods that we're studying and that must apply to your essay. It says identify any specific general changes or developments and support your conclusions with specific evidence. Basically, answer the question that you've chosen. Answer your topic question as best you can, looking at general changes, specific developments, specific changes, whatever you can find in the readings. Okay? That's where your evidence comes from. So if you're doing expository writing, which is writing that presents an argument and it's based on a thesis statement, which includes an opinion, you need evidence to back it up. All right? And your evidence comes from the readings. It says be sure to start with a thesis statement that makes one assertion regarding the role of your selected topic in the 3 literary periods we have studied so far. Hint, the thesis statement is an answer to a topic question. All right, so here's an example thesis statement. Literature from the early explorers of America to the writers of the Revolution hints at an emerging reliance on technology in American society. All right, so this is about science and technology. One of the topic questions what role did literature play in capturing, portraying, and promoting the most important scientific and technological achievements of American history? So what role did literature play in capturing these, promoting them, describing them, forwarding these thoughts? And the answer to that question could be literature from the early explorers, right, from the very first time period all the way through the Revolution, so that includes the colonial period, right, from here to here. It hints at an emerging reliance on technology in American society. All right, so if I look at the writings, I see Americans relying more and more on different forms of technology. That's what I saw. You can't use that example. All right, you have to pick something else. If you decide to use that topic question, your thesis can't be that one, okay? And just so you know, that is not actually what I see. If I were to answer that question, that's not really what I would see. That's just an example, okay? All right, because this is an academic essay, only use third-person language. So avoid words like what? I, me, my. I think that conflicts between cultures could be avoided. You don't want to use that first-person language, all right? It's just not considered formal and academic, all right? Unless you are an expert in American literature. If you are a credible expert in American literature or even American history, maybe you could use first-person language. But when you're working as a student, typically you want to avoid it because you're not considered an expert in the field yet, okay? You must use at least 3 primary sources in your essay. That word primary might throw you off. There's a difference between primary and secondary sources. Okay, primary sources are your assigned readings that were written by the authors themselves. So Columbus's letters are primary sources. The Iroquois creation story itself is a primary source. So the stories and the poems that we read and the letters and the nonfiction that we read that were written by these famous authors, those are considered primary sources. They're your assigned readings. However, you are also assigned biographies of these writers, and you are assigned the outline of American literature. Those are not primary sources. Those are secondary sources. Okay, so anything that the textbook author writes about the author, or pretty much everything in the outline of American literature, it's like background information, those are considered secondary sources, not primary sources. Yes? Mm-hmm. I'll show you exactly how to do it. Hold that thought and come back to it when I get done, and I'll come back to that. Don't forget that, though. I'll go back and show you exactly how to do it. So the question was about citing and how do you cite and document. I'll get back to that. All right, so at least 3 primary sources, minimum 1 from each period. That makes sense, right? You've got 3 periods. I want you to prove your answer to the question with at least 3 selections, 1 from each period. All right, 3 total. Yes?
I know this might sound weird because you used to cite them as primary sources.
Mhm.
Generally, you don't cite your textbook in a class. So, I mean, if you're looking at them as separate stories.
Yeah, the textbook is our entire collection of primary sources that we're going to use.
So we would cite our textbook?
Yes and no. When I answer his questions about documentation and citing, I'll show you exactly how you do it.
Because, I mean, I know our textbook is secondary, and like the things in it will be primary. But, so you want them as individual entities?
Yes. Yes, and I'll show you exactly how to do it.
Saying from the 3 periods, we haven't got to the 3rd period.
Correct. We haven't gotten to the revolutionary time period, but I'm giving you this information on the Essay 1 now just so you understand what you're supposed to be looking for and how you're going to develop. Okay? This isn't due for a couple weeks. It's not due until after the revolutionary time period. And you know what? That's always a good question to answer. When is this thing due? According to your syllabus or the the course schedule I gave you. Does it have a due date?
It's the week of February 10th.
Week of February 10th. Is that February 10th through the 17th? Then it will be due on the 17th, which is a Monday. It will be due February 17th. So that's what, 3 weeks from now? So you still have 3 weeks. And you probably don't even want to start writing it yet because you're not sure what the revolutionary period has in store for you. It might not have anything about the topic that you're interested in right now. That's why, at least with these first 2 time periods, you might want to try to answer all the topic questions. Try and come up with a little bit of information for each one so that by the time you get to the revolutionary period, you can settle on a question that you already have some information for. Anybody confused about anything yet? Are we okay?
You have to have something from every single time period.
You do, and that's why I put this disclaimer here that I have highlighted, minimum 1 from each time period. Now the problem could be, let's say you pick the topic about education. Let's say you pick that one. But you don't feel like you saw anything regarding education from the early explorers or the Native Americans. That's okay. Sometimes a lack of information is still information. Right? So you could say it's obvious that education did not play much of a role in the pre-colonial time period. Because if you look at Christopher Columbus's letters, he mentions X, Y, and Z, so you could cite directly from his letters. However, he never mentions education. So it obviously wasn't that important to him. Does that make sense? So even though the information wasn't there, it's still important that it wasn't there, right? Because maybe the answer to your question says that, you see education as not being important at all in the first 3 time periods, right? So sometimes a lack of information is still worth noting. And if I'm asking you to include at least 1 source per time period and you couldn't find anything, well, then you have to figure out why you didn't find something and still, cite one of those selections as to, why it fits with your topic or doesn't fit with your topic. All right, it says you may use secondary sources also, but they are not required. These would be in addition to your first 3 sources, your 3 primary sources. You can add secondary sources. What are secondary sources?
Whatever the textbook talking about.
The biographies, the introduction that you read last week, or maybe it was week 1, like page 3 to 17 or something. All that information that was just like historical background. Those are considered secondary sources. Same thing with the Outline of American Literature. That's considered a secondary source. You can use those if you want, but only after you've already covered your first 3. Everybody good on that?
And the primary sources, they've talked about themselves.
The primary sources are the actual poems, the actual letters, the actual stories that were written by the famous authors that we're studying.
These secondary sources must come from the textbook also.
That's a good question. Do the secondary sources have to come from the textbook or the Outline of American Literature? I would prefer that they did. If you wanted to do some scholarly research on your own and add that in there, that would be good. I would be impressed. but it's kind of dangerous because if you take something that I don't consider to be credible, you're not helping yourself at that point. If you feel like it's a scholarly source, if it's a published book, like an ebook or a nonfiction book from the library, that would be credible. Journal considered credible. But if you just go on the web and pull something, you could be getting yourself into trouble. So if you want to be safe and do secondary sources, stick to the textbook and the outline of American literature. If you want to take a little bit of a risk, but you're sure that you can do scholarly research and pull some secondary information, by all means go for it. The risk might be worth the reward if you do that. All right, it says, note, while you are expected to incorporate direct quotations and paraphrases from primary sources, right? That's how you incorporate a source, with direct quotes or paraphrasing the material. It says, essays that rely too heavily on borrowed material will be penalized. So if you want a good mark, 40% or less of your essay should be direct quotes and paraphrases. Right? That means 60% of it is your analysis, your commentary based on those quotations and paraphrases and how it fits with your general thesis. Does that make sense? What? There's not a minimum, but if you're looking for a number, 5 to 10% would be a good minimum. I mean, I've seen people do 5% where they just have small quotes, but they do so much analysis of those quotes and explain in detail how those quotes support their thesis that they did a very fine job. You don't need a whole bunch of direct quotes necessarily. You might only need 3 short quotes, one from each time period, as long as you can explain how that quote relates back to your argument and your thesis statement. So 5% could be just enough. But if you're going over 40, then you're just filling your paper full of other people's thoughts and information, and I want more of your commentary, your analysis, your explanation of why those quotes and paraphrases were selected and how they support your thesis. Okay, yeah, it says a good essay will typically incorporate direct quotations and paraphrases as 10 to 30%, but even as low as 5 could be okay. Note, avoid using standalone quotations. These are quotations without signal phrases, like a signal phrase would be, Mr. Palmer said, comma, and then the direct quote. Or Christopher Columbus wrote, comma, then your quotes. Signal phrases can come at the beginning of a direct quotation, they could come in the middle, or they could come at the end, but they indicate, where the information came from. All right, that's in addition to your citations. For information on how to incorporate quotations, there is a document in Lessons, Reading, Writing, and Research Resources, titled How to Incorporate Quotations. So you can use that if you need some help. We already talked about what primary sources are versus secondary sources. Your essay will be graded according to the writing rubric posted in Lessons. Failure to properly cite and document your sources will result in an automatic F for the assignment, regardless of whether the plagiarism is intentional or unintentional. Be very meticulous in your use of sources. I need to remove this particular topic because that is no longer an option. So any questions while I'm doing this? Any questions about the essay? Go ahead.
Not about the essay. I had a question about the last stuff we read. It was talking about orchard and the American Indians. Why was it until they waited, I went to 1770 we couldn't say that it was actually literature?
Anybody have an answer for that?
I mean, I know it's good during the romantic period, but I mean, I don't understand why they waited 200 years to say, okay, we're going to start paying attention to this stuff we wrote 200 years ago.
Why do you think?
I just don't understand why I was asking.
Does anybody have a possible theory? Cody, what do you think?
Romanticism was taken from what they argued. Maybe the idea of literature changed, and so they thought, well, maybe also literature.
So what was the idea of literature beforehand? Was the idea of literature beforehand just that it had to be written down? What do you think? You may not really understand the answer to that question until we study Romanticism and understand the ideas behind it. And I'm not trying to blow you off or blow your question off, but if you don't have a full grasp of what Romanticism was and what the driving forces of Romanticism were, then it's kind of hard to understand why was there this shift? Why did they all of a sudden say, oh wow, Native American stories actually do qualify as literature? Because like our textbook said, It was first written down in was it the 1600s? The story was first recorded and written down by someone in the 1600s, right? Do I have to go back to the textbook? What was the date on that? Go to the Native American Iroquois creation story. 1660 or something like that. And then the actual translation that we read was after that. What was the translation that we read? When was that written? By the actual author? What was it? Okay. 1828. That's helpful to know because 1828 corresponds with guess what literary time period? Romantic time period. So that's helpful, right? Like now you've got this guy translating it. So maybe it got recorded by one guy in the 1600s and just kind of forgotten and dismissed and like, oh yeah, that's one of those crazy Native American stories. That's not really literature, right? But by the time you get to this Romantic period, this guy's now translating the story word for word, paying more attention to it. That's not a coincidence that the version that we're reading was translated in the 1820s. Okay, it corresponds with that Romantic time period. Okay, but Michael, I want to get back to your question about documentation. I made this very easy for you. If you go to lessons, and I believe it's research resources because documentation has to do with research, there's a works cited example page that I created for you. If you follow this format, you'll be in good shape. If you follow this format. Now notice, this is an entry. These are called works cited entries. All right, these are different from in-text citations because these aren't in the text of the paper, right? This is a works cited entry for your entire textbook. The one that's highlighted on the screen is a works cited entry for the entire textbook. Now, John Adams, the letters, BAM, 301 to 308. Guess where that is found? In what? In the textbook. Okay? Now, how do I know that this is related to this? See that right there? The editor's name? That corresponds to this entry. So you need a works cited entry for your entire textbook, and then you can do what are called cross-referenced entries, which are short, right? You don't see like the whole publication information. You don't see the city, New York. You don't see the date. You don't see print or web. You see that, how it's a lot shorter? That way, look, there's what, 1, 2, see BAM again, she's the editor. Thomas Paine is from BAM. So there are 3 separate cross-referenced entries. That makes sense, right? Because in your essay, how many primary sources do you need? 3, there they are. So this person did an essay and they included John Adams, Jonathan Edwards, and Thomas Paine as their 3 primary sources. And those are all cross-referenced to this particular entry, and that saves you the trouble of having to put all of this information after John Adams, the letters. Does that make sense? So you don't have to have a very long, involved entry for each one of your primary sources as long as you have the entire book cited.
Does it have to be under the first one, or could it be under your third?
Alphabet has to be alphabetical.
Okay.
Must be alphabetical. That's why. Yeah, you might think like, well, if you're cross-referencing everything to BAM, maybe she should come first. But the rule states that it has to be alphabetical. But I'll still know. Okay, pages 301 to 308 in what? Well, I go to BAM. Okay, BAM. Yes, BAM is listed. There she is. Okay, so that's how it's done. And then what would this be? Bingo, a secondary source, right? I said the Outline of American Literature is your secondary source. She is the author/editor for the secondary source. So you can pretty much copy this format. There's one change you need to make though, because I did this last year when I made this. You're working with the 8th edition now. This is set up for the 7th edition. But the format is there for you. That's how you do it. So if you change the edition, and I believe you would have to change the date too to 2013. Maybe it's 2012, I'm not sure. But change the edition, change the date, and then these page numbers, like let's just say you did happen to use John Adams. I don't know if these page numbers are accurate or not. I may have just typed in random page numbers just to show you the format. Everybody got that? I made it very easy for you. Follow this format, okay? Go ahead.
If we did it the other way, though, it wouldn't be wrong.
If you did like full entries for each one, it would be okay. That would be acceptable. But this is a lot easier to work with. This is easier for the reader. Okay, I'm the reader, so I don't want to think like you use like 3 separate textbooks. You know, this way I know all the entries came from one. And your job is always to make things as easy as possible for the reader. That's your job as a student. At the bottom here, it's got some notes on using sources. If you use any secondary sources from the Norton Anthology, such as introductions or biographical information, use the editor's last name and page number in your in-text citation. Use BAM. Okay, use BAM, and then you're in good shape. BAM 306. Okay, because you already have a works cited entry for BAM. All right, so if you use the biographical information for Anne Bradstreet, which appears on page X, you would put the direct quotation you use from the secondary source, parentheses BAM 106. Now that's only for the biographical information. That's not if you take a direct quote from something Bradstreet wrote. If it's something Bradstreet wrote, the in-text citation would have what? Bradstreet. Okay? Some people think like, well, I'm just going to cite BAM for everything because BAM's the editor of the book and she's the one that wrote the whole book. Not really. She didn't technically write the poems of Anne Bradstreet. Bradstreet did. So if you quote Anne Bradstreet, you use her name in the in-text citation.
Would you use page number also, or just put that?
Page number also. You would only use the page, you would omit the last name and only use the page number if Bradstreet's name appears in the signal phrase. Anne Bradstreet wrote in her first poem, comma, quote, I love my husband, end quote, parentheses 106, because you have Anne Bradstreet in the signal phrase. Okay? Any other questions about documentation? Make sure you document correctly. Be very careful with your documentation. It's the #1 reason people don't do well on their essays. All right, as far as the outline of American literature goes, I've got about 6 minutes left to talk about this. But we said it covers 2 time periods, early American and colonial. If you look at the subheadings in the chapter, the first one says the literature of exploration. That's the first time period, right? We had explorers and Native American literature. That's what we had in our first time period. Question mark to 1620, okay? So everything we covered, hopefully you're familiar with most of this information here. Talks about the explorers. I think it mentions, it mentions Roanoke in 1585, which was the first colony but didn't really last, so that's why we're not really using 1585 as a date. It also mentions Leif Erikson and the Vikings that came 400 years before Christopher Columbus. Okay, so actually what applies to American literature, I guess, instead of just history, because if I say, okay, the Vikings explored in 1100 AD, that's a historical fact. What does it have to do with literature? Well, it says the Old Norse Vinland Saga recounts how the adventurous Leif Erikson and a band of wandering Norsemen settled briefly somewhere on the northeast coast of America. So that is the first European written record of exploration in America. So technically, that's part of American literature, all right, because it was written in or about the New World, right? So for something to be considered American literature, we need to ask the question, does it have to be written in America? What do you think? No? Why not? Okay, fair enough. It depends on how narrow of a definition you want to work with. Okay, so some of the premier authors of American literature were called expatriates. Expatriates. They moved over to Europe for a while after World War II because it was cheap to live there and all the culture and the art was coming out of Europe. For some reason, the culture and the art seems to come out of Europe through most of history, and then America adopts it later. Now things are starting to shift where more culture today comes out of America and other countries adopt it. But for a long, long time, culture came out of Europe and was adopted by America afterwards. So these expatriates, they would go over to Europe and they would write literature. You know, they would get into groups with other poets and other writers and, you know, discuss their ideas, and then they would come back to America. Now, did the literature they write while they were in Europe, is that considered American literature? You know, Ernest Hemingway, I believe, wrote some of his works while he was over in Europe. Well, he was living there. You know, left America, wasn't sure if it was permanent or not, just went over there and started writing. It was written by an American. I mean, does that count as American literature? I mean, if we're working with a broad definition, then I would say yes, it probably does. Was Leif Erikson an American? Not really, but he came and he visited, and then he wrote about his experiences, so it's about America. So if we're using a very broad definition, that's why that could be considered American literature. All right. The next section says the colonial period in New England, and that's where we start this week, the colonial/Puritan period. This gives us information about the Puritans, which is really important. Gives us some information about the colonies. Most of the work we're looking at is from Puritans or Pilgrims. There will be information from the quiz based on this background information on the Puritans. And then you have biographical information. This is in addition to the biographical information in your textbook on William Bradford. So I said that 1620 is kind of our turning point from the last period to this period. And William Bradford is sitting right there at 1620. His work was published, I think the date of publication was 1620, may have been 1630. But either way, William Bradford is sitting right on the fence there, where people kind of stopped exploring and started coming to stay. All right, so they have included William Bradford in the colonial period. We discussed him last week, so we're going to consider him pre-colonial, but just know that he's right on the edge there. He marks the shift, right? The landing of the Mayflower on Plymouth Rock lands the shift of this new ideology behind the literature that people were writing, right? When you come to a place or a region for a different purpose, your literature is going to change, okay? He's not writing back to the people at home to say, I need more money, or here's what I see. That's not necessarily his intention anymore. His intention is just describing the hardships that they faced, and it's more for his people that are in America. His audience changed and his purpose changed. And that's why we have a new literary time period, okay? Because audiences change, purposes change, styles of writing change. So like John Smith's stuff was kind of adventurous, was very adventurous. Christopher Columbus's stuff was somewhat adventurous. William Bradford's not very adventurous. His is more explaining hardship, thanking God, talking about some of the technical, details of setting up a new colony. So his purpose and his audience change. What's that? Yeah, it's more documentation. I would agree. So when you see changes in audience, purpose, style, those are reasons that you're going to have a shift from one period to the next. I'm on my way.